Life is full of decisive moments, and I knew that dinner would be one of them. While choosing the restaurant, I thought about every detail. The sophistication of the atmosphere, the aroma of the dishes filling the air, the background music that barely distracted but created the perfect setting. This wasn't just any dinner. It was the stage for something far greater. I sent out the invitations via text, using polite and neutral words. "I would like to gather everyone to celebrate the family's achievements," I wrote. Marcelo replied almost immediately in his usual tone of superiority. "Of course, darling. I just hope it's not over the top." Ah, how he loved to appear in control, even when the ground was crumbling beneath his feet. Sitting in the leather chair of my office, I looked at the computer screen. The quarterly report showed yet another exceptional result from my company. My team and I had built something solid, innovative, a network no one could shake. I had always been like this, a strategist from a young age. I learned never to depend on anyone. Growing up in a home where my mother balanced invisible plates to support my sister and me taught me the value of resilience. Marcelo came into my life when I thought I was complete. We met at a corporate event. He was the type who stood out with overconfidence and a charm that came with a well-calculated smile. At first, I believed in his promises of stability, of partnership. He was a lawyer, with a career that aligned well with my rising success. But there was something about him I chose to ignore, out of convenience, out of a desire to believe in the image he sold, a relentless need for control and status. Still, our life seemed perfect to outsiders. Me, the successful businesswoman, him, the ambitious lawyer, and together we were the admired couple at any social event. And Carolina, my younger sister, was always around, even when I didn't ask her to be. Carolina had always been different from me. While I built a career with focus and effort, she clung to the opportunities life threw at her, many of them through doors I opened. I brought her into my company when she was lost, not knowing I was nurturing a snake that would grow in the shadow of my trust. But that night, there would be no more shadows. Everything would be exposed under the bright light of the crystal chandelier in the restaurant. I chose an elegant black dress that conveyed exactly what I wanted: seriousness and control. I arrived at the restaurant before everyone else, adjusting the details with the manager. I wanted everything to be impeccable. As my family began to arrive, I greeted each of them with a calculated smile. Carolina arrived in a dress screaming for attention, and Marcelo, always punctual, walked in beside her. He kissed my cheek, but his gaze was empty. As the dishes were served, I heard my mother comment on how lucky I was, how wonderful it was to see a united family. I swallowed hard, feeling the bitter taste of the moment to come. I knew that night would mark a before and after in my life. And the best part? Marcelo and Carolina had no idea that the after would begin there, in front of the entire family. The silence at the table was comforting to me, though laden with expectations for the others. Marcelo, to my left, fiddled with the napkin, folding and unfolding it nervously. Carolina, on my right, seemed too focused on her plate. I could feel the weight of her unease without even looking at her. My mother, always the voice of harmony, commented on how impressive the restaurant I had chosen was. I smiled politely, but my mind was already miles away. I had rehearsed that moment so many times it felt like a scene from a script I had written, directed, and was about to star in. I waited for the main course to begin the act. I wanted everyone to feel relaxed, satisfied, and off guard. As the waiters began serving the dishes, I took a sip of the wine I had personally selected. Dry, full-bodied, with the intensity the night required. I stood up slowly, picking up my glass with calculated elegance. I knew all eyes would be on me as soon as the metallic clink of the cutlery against the glass called for their attention. I want to thank you all for being here tonight. This dinner is special because I've finally decided it's time to share something I've been holding on to for a long time. Something none of you at this table expected to hear. But some here know very well what it's about. My voice was firm, but carried a cold calmness that made Marcelo freeze in his seat. His eyes were fixed on me, trying to read between the lines what was coming next. Carolina, on the other hand, shifted slightly in her chair as if she wanted to disappear. In recent months, I've had the opportunity to reflect deeply on trust, loyalty, and family. I believed we had that here, but I've realized not everyone at this table shares the same values. My mother set her fork down, her eyes searching mine for an explanation. "What do you mean, Alessandra?" she asked, with that cautious tone only a mother can use. I took a deep breath, feigning a hint of sorrow. I looked at each of them, letting the suspense settle like a heavy cloud over the table. Marcelo and Carolina have been having an affair for 2 years. My mother widened her eyes, pure shock etched across her face. The other family members murmured, and confusion took hold of the table. Marcelo tried to speak, but his voice came out strained. "This is absurd! How can you say something like that?" I stared at him, lifting my chin, and said coldly, "Oh, Marcelo, I knew you would say that. That's why I brought proof." With a firm motion, I pulled a thick envelope from my purse and placed it at the center of the table. The sharp sound of it hitting the glass silenced all whispers. "Here are photos taken by a private investigator. The two of you, together, leaving a motel countless times." Carolina's face turned pale, as if all the blood had drained from her body. Marcelo began to stammer, reaching out as if to grab the envelope. "Did you really think you could fool me? That I wouldn't notice?" I continued now with a hint of indignation in my voice. "For 2 years, while I maintained this facade of a marriage and gave you opportunities, Carolina, you both laughed at me behind my back." My mother held the envelope with trembling hands as some of the photos spilled out onto the table. My father, who had remained silent until then, let out a heavy sigh of disapproval. "Alessandra, please, can we talk about this in private?" Marcelo begged, trying to regain some control of the situation. I laughed, a short, bitter sound that even felt strange to me. "Talk? No, Marcelo. I've waited too long for this. This conversation is public because your betrayal doesn't deserve secrecy." I looked at Carolina, who hadn't uttered a single word, and leaned closer. "Is silence your only defense, Carolina? Don't you have anything to say?" She stared at me for a moment, her eyes filled with shame and perhaps regret, but it didn't matter. I didn't want to hear excuses. That night wasn't about them. It was about me and what was to come. I sat back down, observing the silent chaos I had unleashed at the table. This was only the beginning, and they had no idea what was coming next. They were cornered, and I knew it. Marcelo, his face flushed, looked like a trapped animal. Carolina, on the other hand, was motionless, as if hoping the ground would swallow her whole. The silence at the table was broken only by the occasional clink of cutlery, which someone awkwardly moved in a futile attempt to feign normalcy. No one knew what to say, and that was perfect. I waited a few seconds, allowing the weight of the moment to settle among us. Then I raised my wineglass again, as if to toast the end of their lies. I want everyone to know that I'm not here to apologize or pretend this can be resolved with a conversation. I've already made all the necessary decisions. Marcelo's eyes locked onto mine, pleading. Not with words, he knew that would be futile, but with that cowardly look of someone who realizes they've lost control. "Alessandra, we can handle this differently. We don't need to expose anyone further." "You're better than this," he began, his voice trembling, still trying to sound rational. I laughed, not a light or nervous laugh, but a cold, sarcastic sound. "I'm better than this? Funny you say that, Marcelo, after 2 years of lying to me. 2 years of laughing behind my back while I upheld this sham of a marriage." Carolina finally found the courage to open her mouth, but her voice was barely audible. "Alessandra, please, I can explain." I turned to her, my tone sharper than ever. "Explain? Explain what, Carolina? That you, my sister, decided to destroy the last shred of trust between us? That while I gave you opportunities, offered you a career, you repaid me with betrayal? She averted her gaze, tears already threatening to fall. But I felt no pity, not after what I had discovered. Let's simplify things, I continued, looking at both of them. Marcelo, tomorrow I'll be filing for divorce. You won't be entitled to anything. Not the house, not the money, not even the shoes you're wearing. He opened his mouth to protest, but I raised my hand, silencing him. Don't bother, I've already consulted the best lawyers in the city. And as for you, Carolina, your life of luxury is over. You're fired from my company. Her eyes widened, and she tried to say something, but I didn't stop. Before you think about running to another comfortable opportunity, let me clarify something. I've already arranged for your only job offer to be as a cleaner at that rundown hotel that pays a pittance. My father, who had been silent until then, placed his napkin on the table with a heavy sigh. Alessandra, you're right. I can't defend what they did. It's despicable. My mother nodded, her eyes still brimming with tears. You did what you had to do. We're on your side. Those words didn't erase the betrayal, but feeling their support was like a balm. I stood up, the weight of months of pain and planning finally lifting from my shoulders. From today on, no one will ever have the power to betray me like this again. Now, you two can deal with the consequences of what you've done. I walked toward the restaurant's exit, feeling everyone's eyes on my back. I didn't care. That night, something inside me changed forever. The Alessandra who left that restaurant was no longer the same person who had walked in. And as the restaurant doors closed behind me, I was thinking of one thing. What would come next in my life would finally be something I chose for myself. The cold night outside contrasted with the stifling heat I had left in the restaurant. My heart beat steadily, not racing, but with the strength of someone who had just faced a battlefield and emerged victorious. I didn't look back as I left the restaurant, but I could imagine the scene. Marcelo, defeated, his ego in shreds, trying to mask his humiliation. Carolina, perhaps still seated, curled up, trying to process the collapse of the comfortable world she had known. When I reached my car, I let out a long sigh. My body seemed to carry months of accumulated tension, and for the first time, I felt like I could breathe. I started the engine and drove through the city's illuminated streets without a clear destination. I needed to organize my thoughts, to process what had just happened. My mother called. It wasn't surprising. I knew she wouldn't stay silent for long. I considered ignoring it, but decided to answer. Alessandra? Her voice was low, hesitant, but with a firmness that surprised me. Can we talk? I took a deep breath before responding. Of course, Mom. What do you want to say? I wanted to tell you that I'm proud of you. I know it doesn't change what happened, but you were very brave tonight. Her words caught me off guard. My mother had always been a reserved woman, rarely expressing support or emotion so directly. Thank you, Mom, I replied, trying to suppress the knot forming in my throat. Your father is on your side, too. He didn't say much at the restaurant, but don't be mistaken. He was devastated by what Carolina did. I knew she was trying to comfort me, but part of me still wondered how my family would handle this in the long run. Carolina was their daughter, after all. I hope you both truly understand, Mom, I said cautiously. Because, after today, nothing will ever be the same. She was silent for a moment, as if pondering my words. We understand, dear, and I don't blame you for moving forward however you see fit. You have my support, always. After we hung up, I felt lighter. Maybe it was my mother's support, or perhaps it was simply the fact that I was finally closing a chapter of betrayals and lies. When I got home, I took off my shoes and went straight to my room. The house, which once felt like a home, was now just an empty space. The memories of Marcelo were still there, embedded in the walls and furniture, but they no longer carried the same weight. As I looked at myself in the mirror, I decided it would be the last night I allowed that betrayal to define who I was. Tomorrow would be a new day, and I would start rebuilding my life. Not to prove anything to anyone, but for myself. I went to bed with a clearer mind, but not without one last reflection. If they thought that night would mark the end of my story, they were gravely mistaken. I was just getting started. The next morning, the first thing I did was open all the windows in the house. The cold air rushed into the rooms, driving out the lingering weight of the past that seemed to hang there. I needed a fresh start, and this was the first step. The divorce was already underway. My lawyer, efficient as ever, assured me that Marcelo would have no loopholes to contest. Now it was just a matter of time. As I sorted through my belongings to donate some items that reminded me of him, an unexpected message appeared on my phone. It was from Carolina. Just 3 words. "Please forgive me." I stared at the screen, a mix of anger and disbelief washing over me. How could she have the audacity to ask for forgiveness after everything? I didn't reply. At that moment, there was no room for her in my life. Over the following days, I began to redefine my routine. Work had always been my fortress, but for the first time, I decided I needed time for myself. I delegated more responsibilities to my team, something I had never allowed myself to do before. I planned trips, things I had always postponed because of work or marriage. My first destination would be Italy, a place I had always dreamed of visiting, but which Marcelo dismissed as overrated. Before leaving, I decided to meet with my mother. I knew she was also dealing with the consequences of what Carolina had done, even though she tried to hide it. We arranged to meet at a quiet cafe in the city. When she arrived, I noticed something different about her, a mixture of sadness and acceptance. "How are you?" she asked, placing her hand over mine. "Better," I answered honestly, starting to feel like I'm in control of my life again. She nodded, but there was something more she wanted to say. "Your sister Carolina is devastated. She lost her job, her home, and now she's staying with a friend." There was a pleading tone in her voice, but I refused to give in. "I warned you, Mom. She made her choice. Now she has to deal with the consequences." My mother didn't insist, but her eyes revealed the internal conflict she was facing. And I understood. Carolina was her daughter, but to me, she was no longer my sister. I left the cafe feeling like I was finally beginning to let go of everything. Marcelo, Carolina, the wounds of the past, they no longer had power over me. That afternoon, I zipped up my suitcase and took one last look around my house before heading to the airport. During the flight, I felt a calmness I hadn't experienced in years. The sky seemed infinite, a reflection of the possibilities that lay ahead. I was ready to discover who I was outside the confines of a failed marriage and a toxic relationship with my sister. As the plane soared over the ocean, I thought about the Alessandra who was rediscovering herself, the woman who had found strength amidst betrayal. I didn't know what awaited me on the other side, but for the first time, it didn't scare me. It was the start of something new, and I was ready to embrace it fully. The morning breeze in Florence was crisp, but the gentle warmth of the sun embraced me as I walked along the cobblestone streets. Around me, the murmur of tourists mingled with the distant sound of street musicians. It was a scene of freedom, so far removed from the life I had left behind. I felt alive in a way I never had before, as though I was finally in charge of every choice I made. That afternoon, as I savored a coffee in a quiet piazza, I decided to open my email. Among work messages and trivial updates, there was one from my lawyer. "The divorce has been finalized. Marcelo couldn't contest the terms." A smile escaped before I even realized it. He was officially out of my life, and the feeling was pure liberation. I heard from acquaintances that Marcelo was living in a small rented apartment on the city's outskirts, struggling to pay his bills. The reputation he had once cherished so much had been shattered. Key clients began abandoning him, And without the financial support he had enjoyed while with me, his facade of success crumbled. He tried calling me a few times, but I blocked all his numbers. There was no room for reconciliation, not even for an apology. As for Carolina, she had taken the job as a cleaner at the rundown hotel. I received an anonymous message from an employee describing how she tried to avoid being recognized, keeping her head down as she cleaned the hallways. They said she often cried, but I felt no pity. My mother urged me a few times to forgive her, but forgiving didn't mean allowing her back into my life. Even so, I held no resentment. I realized that the weight of hatred is as harmful as the weight of betrayal. I let both go. I didn't need to seek further revenge. Life had already ensured that Marcelo and Carolina received what they deserved. My business, now managed with more balance, thrived. Delegating responsibilities not only gave me more time for myself, but also strengthened my team. I learned that the world doesn't fall apart if I'm not controlling everything, and that was a valuable lesson. As I strolled through Renaissance art galleries that same week, I realized something important. I didn't need anyone to validate me. For years, I had sought approval, first from my parents, then from Marcelo, and, in some way, even from Carolina. But now, that need was gone. I met new people during my travels. Some became friends, others mere acquaintances who crossed my path briefly. One afternoon, during a dinner in Rome, I met Gabriel, a Colombian architect who seemed to understand the weight and lightness we carry simultaneously in life. He was unlike anyone I had ever known, calm, kind, and unhurried. We shared stories, and he spoke of his own fresh starts. It wasn't love at first sight, but it was an encounter that left an impression. Back in Brazil months later, my return was peaceful. My house felt different now, lighter. I decided to redecorate it, transforming it into a space that truly reflected who I was. There were no more traces of Marcelo, no remnants of what we had been. It was just me, Alessandra, building a home for myself. My mother continued to visit me regularly. She never gave up trying to reconcile Carolina and me, but she had come to accept that I needed time, perhaps a lot of time, before even considering it. My father, always more reserved, respected my silence on the matter. Over time, my relationship with Gabriel grew. He didn't try to fill the voids Marcelo left because he knew those spaces belonged to me. He simply walked beside me, letting me decide where I wanted to go. Today, as I write these words in my new office, I feel a sense of peace. Marcelo and Carolina are just closed chapters, lessons that shaped who I am. My business continues to grow, but my greatest achievement is the freedom I've found within myself. Life isn't always what we imagine, but sometimes it gives us exactly what we need to start anew. And now, looking toward the horizon, I know the future still has so much to offer. I'm in no rush. After all, what truly matters is that this time I'm the one in control of my story.